So we're doing Parshas Lech Lecha on page 54. What about it? They're fine? Okay, good.
You can talk, you won't be taken.
Yeah, even if you're on there, we won't pay you. Even if you do a cameo appearance.
It's okay, you won't be taken.
Okay, so we're on Parshas Lech Lecha, page 54. And it begins, V'yomer Hashem al Avram, Lech Lecha me'artzecha, and it goes on, right? Hashem says to Avram, you should go from your land. All the commentaries ask the same question right in the beginning. What does it mean, Lech Lecha? It seems to be sort of extraneous words, because really Hashem says to Avram, go, leave here. But what does it mean, go to you, right? So there are many commentaries talk about this. The first on 54, the first one tells you that Lech Lecha does not mean just you should leave here. It means you should go and discover yourself. You should find out who you are. Right now, Avram is living with his family, his parents. He's living in a place of idol worship. And even though he has already become a leader, a spiritual leader in the world, revolutionizing the whole concept of monotheism or ethical monotheism that he comes up with and he sees as being the truth, he still hasn't gone out on his own and come to a plateau, a spiritual plateau. So he's being told here, go to find yourself. Go within yourself. Not only are you to leave here and to influence the world, but you have to find your potential of who you are. And so he begins with that. Now we all know that Avraham, according to Pirkei Avos, was given 10 tests by God in order to prove that he was the one who should bring ethical monotheism to the world, to be effective, and to be considered the one who is loved by God in a very unique way. So this test of Lech Lecha it appears to be, the first test that the Torah talks about, which is you have to leave home. And it's not so easy to leave home. It says there's certain things, certain curses that happen to people when they leave home. You become an unknown. You go to a new city, nobody knows you. You have to prove yourself all the time. It says that it's hard to to gather wealth when you go to a new place. Right? And so here Avraham is going to become wealthy, God tells him. He's going to go to this new place and become famous. Right? So we see that he has these special blessings, but he has to do it. He has to be committed to following the word of God, right, and going. Now, if you look at though in the ethics of our fathers in Pirkei Avos, and it tells us that there were 10 tests, it tells us that this was actually not the first one. This is the first one the Torah tells us, so it must be significant. But there's one that is hinted at that's not actually said straight out, and that comes up later when God says, I am the God who took you out of Ur-Kasdim. I took you out of a place called Ur-Kasdim. So Ur-Kasdim was a location where Abraham lived, and God took him out. But it's also a reference to a fire. Because Ur and Or, light, is like a fire. And we know the story that Abraham had a confrontation with Nimrod, who was at that time the dictator to the world, to the known world. And Nimrod wanted Abraham to bow down to him and to his idols, to his beliefs. And Avraham was not prepared to do it, being a monotheist. So Nimrod said, well, look, I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'll give you a choice. Either you bow down to me, or I'm going to throw you in this fire. So, right, not much of a choice, right? It's like the mafia. So he says, one of the two. So Abraham says, well, then throw me in the fire. God will save me. And he throws him in the fire, and God saves him. So that's a pretty big test, right? That's a test where God puts you in a situation where you're prepared to die. That's it. It's over. Game over, right? And anything that you've done, it's finished. You made a mistake. You don't understand something correctly. Even if you believe in God, maybe God wants you to die. Whatever the case is, you're putting yourself in a situation where you're going to die. That's a big test. So if that's such a big test, why doesn't the Torah tell us? The Torah tells us about this test that Abraham has to leave home. I don't know about you, but it seems to me that it's harder to put yourself in a situation where you're going to get thrown into a fire and killed is harder to do than it is to leave home. And leaving home is not easy, right? To leave your parents, leave your family.
It's ready
right?
to fire.
It can be very hard. But be thrown into a fire is a much bigger thing. So which is it? Like, why does the Torah tell us this story about Abraham having to leave his home? And that's his test. But the test of being thrown into fire doesn't mention. Which one of these is like a bigger deal? And I think being thrown into a fire is a bigger deal. So the Torah should tell us that. And it doesn't tell us that. It only tells us about this one. So the commentaries have many different answers. But one of the answers I think is worthy of discussing is that the test of being thrown into a fire is a one-time thing. It's a serious thing, but it's a one-time thing. I remember when I was a kid, right, and where I grew up, there were not very many Torah-observant Jews. And I remember going to a weekend with a bunch of kids, Jewish kids, and the rabbi got up and spoke, and he said, who here would die as a Jew? If they came to you and said, either convert or die, who would? And almost everyone raised their hands. They said, we would rather die than have to give up our religion. These were not observant Jews, but we felt that we would do that, right? I also did. So he said to us, if you were prepared to die as a Jew, are you also prepared to live as a Jew? And it was the first time as a child ever hearing anyone speak in such a way that it meant something to live as a Jew. I just thought at that point it meant that you believe in it. But he was saying, no, that there's more to it. Right? It was my first exposure to that. That's what's happening here. Abraham is put in a situation of life and death. It's an enormous decision. But after you made the decision, it's over. You're dead, or you're not dead. But that's it, you made it. To this decision, where God tells him, leave home, leave your land, leave your culture, leave everything behind you, and go start a new life, that is a decision that affects him every moment of his life from then on, for the next 100 years. He has to live with that. And every moment, he can change his mind. Every moment, he can go back. Every moment, he can say it's not worth it. And he doesn't. And therefore, we see that this test of Lech Lecha, if we understand it in this way, of leaving home, is a greater test. This tells us, a lot of important substance here, this idea, because it tells you that there's really, in Judaism, there's the idea of what a hero is. Or in the world, there's a hero, right? I remember reading a story recently about a fellow, I forgot his name, but he was walking down the street and he sees a fire in a house and he runs into the house and he saves the people, right? Probably it happens more often than we think. So they go and they interview him and they say, what you're a hero. You saved all these people. And he said, I'm not a hero. I'm actually pretty afraid of things. He said, but what am I supposed to do? I walk by, I see a fire, there's people inside the house. How do you not help? Right? That idea of being a hero is being in the right place at the right time. Meaning, I'm not necessarily a heroic person, but I was in that situation. I had to do it. We have other people who every day of their life give of themselves to help others. You have, I was recently, I was at a funeral for a woman, and they said how her father-in-law lived with them for like 10 years. 10 years. And that was her father-in-law, not her father. But she took care of him every day. She made sure he had food to eat, and when he couldn't, take care of himself, she took care of him, and she cleaned him and took care of him for 10 years, right? So, was she a hero? I think that's a hero.
Yeah, of course.
A hero is someone who does something every day.
That's fantastic.
And nobody knows about it. You're not in the news. Nobody put her in the newspaper and said, you know what she did? Every day she got up early before she went to work and she bathed her father-in-law, who was an old man. She made him food that he could eat. She took all of his yelling and screaming and problems and took care of him every single day. Right? And then what did she do? She went off to work, or she took the kids to school, or she did day in and day out, and day in and day out. So we understand from this understanding that the Lech Lecha is the greatest test because it's a consistent, every day, day in and day out test. That's what a Jewish hero is. A Jewish hero is not a person who's in the right place at the right time. A Jewish hero is the men and women who get up every day and go to work to make sure that they have money to educate their kids. The ones who make time to learn with their kids, who take care of older people, who go and spend time taking care of the poor. Those are heroes, right? That's the big test. That's why Lech Lecha is the way that it is, and it says it in this way. So when we go on, so it says you're going to go from Me'artzecha, Me'molodatecha, U'mebeis avicha. It says here that Abraham is being told he has to go from first his land, then it's from his birthplace, and then from his father's house. Where? Ela Aretz Asher Areka, to the land I will show you. So first thing is, if you're telling Abraham that you should go, you don't go in this way. This is backwards. When you leave home, I say to you, okay, I want you to come to my class. So what do you do first? First you leave your apartment. And then from your apartment you leave the building. And then the building you leave the neighborhood. And then if I'm far away from the neighborhood, you leave the province, maybe you leave the country. Right? But you don't leave the country before the province, before the neighborhood, before your apartment. But that's what he says here. You should leave your land, and then you should leave your birthplace, which is your neighborhood, and then you should leave your father's house, which is your house. That's backwards. Who does that? You can't leave the land before you leave your father's house, right? So clearly it's not talking about physical. It's talking about the conditioning, the environmental effect on people. And here you have environmental effect on these people, on every person, is greater from your culture. It is next from your area that you grew up in and from your parents' home. The culture we come from, where do we come from? We come from, right, the West. We have our music. There's a certain type of music. We have our ideas, what's right, what's wrong, our liberal ideas, our conservative ideas. This we pick up here in Canada. A person who raised in Iran, Iraq, or in the Sudan, wherever, they're going to have different ideas. They have a different culture. The hardest thing to give up is really your culture. It's the biggest thing. So you leave that first. Not necessarily the hardest, but it's the first thing you leave. Leave your culture. Then it says you have to leave now your neighborhood. That is the way things were done where you were, right, in your area. Like, I hear all the time, in South Africa, this is how we did it, right? In Montreal, this is how we did it. I hear this all the time, right? Nothing wrong with it. But you had a certain way of doing things. So now God's saying, you can't do it that way. Because the way you were doing it was wrong. It doesn't mean the way you were doing it was wrong. It means the idol worshippers from this land were doing it wrong. And then the way of your father. It's an interesting thing that says that if a person comes from a family of murderers, to be only a thief is righteous. Why? Because what does it mean, a family of murderers? It means that murder is not, you're not afraid to murder. If you see your parents murder people, you don't think murder is so bad. Because my parents, who are good, must be good people. They're my parents. They love me and I love them, right? So if they're doing something, it must not be so bad, right? So, but if I come to the realization that it is bad, but I'm only half as bad, then I'm pretty good. Like, it's sort of like if you see, let's say you see that you go to the store with your mother, and your mother changes prices on stuff in the store, right? It says $10 for this, and she moves the prices.
That's a good idea.
Right? And she does that. So if you see her do that a few times, you think it's okay. Yeah, it's not the right thing, but nobody really cares. Why? Because your mother wouldn't do something that's really wrong. Right? It's very hard to get rid of those types of things. Right? They say that if you were abused as a child, there's a good chance you'll be an abuser. Why? Because you saw that as a normal response. If your father yelled all the time, right, when he was angry, then you'll probably yell when you get angry. Because it's a learned thing that we pick up. So it's very hard to break. And that's the last thing he has to leave. He has to leave what he learned in his father's house. He has to leave his culture. He has to leave the country, the area he comes from, and he has to leave what he learned in his father's house. And that's the right order. Right? It's not the right order physically, but it's the right order philosophically. And that's why God tells him to do that. And then he's going to take him to the land which I will show you. Interestingly enough, he doesn't tell him what that land is. Right? It's the land I will show you. We know that's the land of Israel. In those days called the land of Canaan. And then he tells him what I'm going to do for you. If you go there, I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you, God l'shmecha, and I'll make you famous. And then it says, v'hayeh bracha, and you will be a blessing. So why does he tell us all these things in this order and four? So first thing he tells them, you'll be a great nation. So I said before, one of the things that happens to a person when they leave home, they become a refugee, is they often don't have the peace of mind to have a family. They're going to have a house and your spouse and you're living together and you have a family and everything is nice and peaceful. People say, how can I start a family at a time like this? How can I start a family? I don't have a job. How can I start a family? I'm a refugee here. I'm not accepted yet. So God said, that's true. That happens. I'm blessing you. You will have a lot of offspring. Next thing is, it says, the Goy Gadol, and it says, "V'avarechacha," and I will bless you. I will bless you. There it means that I will give you wealth. And that's another thing I told you. When a person leaves home and they're a refugee, they usually don't make the same kind of money as if they were in their hometown, because they don't know anybody. Nobody trusts them. They don't know anyone. They don't know how things work. You go to a country, sometimes you pull out. I remember when I first moved to Canada 25 years ago, I couldn't figure a nickel from a quarter. They look too much the same, right? So you don't even know what money looks like when you move to a new country. So God says, don't worry about that. I will make you rich. And then then it says, God l'shmecha, I'll make you famous. Because if a person's a refugee, they're also not famous. You have millions of people just like you. The Canadians say, another Syrian, another this, another that is here. So here, the God's saying, no, you will become famous. That's fine. That deals with the three curses that happen to a person who's a refugee. God says, in your case, you do what I tell you, everything good will come from it. And then he says, Ve'eya bracha, and you will be a blessing, which is odd. What does that mean, you will be a blessing? I already told you I'll bless you, but how are you a blessing? So the commentaries give us a number of answers. One is that you will become such an example to the world of what a person should be, that parents will bless their children, and they'll say, you should be like Abraham. I want my children to grow up to be like Abraham, because he was such a person that you are a blessing. Your mention of your name is a blessing for somebody else. That's one. Another one is that God gave Abraham the key to the storeroom of blessings. That up until that point, the only way you could get a blessing was from God. God wanted to give you wealth. God wanted you to have a life where things went well. You wanted to have a charmed life, so to speak. It came from God, gave it to you. God still gives it to you, right? Even today. But God gave Abraham the keys, the power to be able to also give blessings. They're blessings from God, but that Abraham could direct them. So God says to him, because of who you are, you'll have that ability. And later on it says, those who will bless you will be blessed, those who curse you will be cursed. That's the same idea, right? That you'll have that power within, that if somebody is good to the Jewish people, they're good to your offspring, then you can bless them and they'll have goodness as well. So that's what that means. Then it says, V'yavarcha mivarechacha, right? And those who bless you, I will bless. M'kalelcha error, and those who curse you, I will curse. V'nivarchu b'chal kol misparchos ha'adama. And blessed through you will be all of the people of the land. So they tell a story about the Chafetz Chaim. There's probably a story about many people, but the Chafetz Chaim lived in the 1800s, and it says that in Poland, where he lived in the small town, the non-Jews used to come to him and ask him if he would walk on their field. Just walk through their field. Like, let's say they grew corn. Walk through their field. Right? Because they felt he was such a righteous person that God would bless wherever he walked. So if he walked on our field, we would have good crops. So they used to ask him to go. That's what this is saying. Right? It says, and you will bless all of the people of the land. In other words, the regular people will see you, and they'll see something special about you, something extraordinary about you, and they'll all want to become close to you.
Sorry, Rabbi, when I was selling my house in South Africa to move here, I was taking the mezuzah, because I sold to non-Jews, and I was taking the mezuzahs off, and they said to me, please, can't you leave it on on your front door? You seem to have been so happy here, and a lovely home and this and that. Please, won't you leave it so that we can get a blessing from you? Well, I thought, you know what, how far wrong can I go? I'll go with one less mezuzah. When I come here, I'll buy another mezuzah. I didn't tell them that wait for the Mishalochim when they come by.
You're going to get, everyone's going to ask you for
donation.
money.
But this was just, they were so, the idea of having a Jewish blessing on their home.
Yep.
So I just let
Yeah,
it.
you hear about this.
Yeah.
So then it says, V'yelech Avraham kasher diber elav Hashem. Abraham went as God told him to. V'yelech ito Lot, and Lot went with him. V'yavraham ben chamesh shanim v'shivim shana v'tzeis mecharon. And Abraham was 75 years old, right, when he left Haran. Now, he took with him Lot. Who was Lot? Lot was his nephew. Avram had a brother, and his brother, right, was influenced by Avram. His brother's name was Haran, and he was influenced by him. And he also believed in monotheism, but according to the Medrash, he was sort of wishy-washy. He was, it's like I tell the story about the woman who calls the rabbi. She's in the hospital, and she says, "God, come down, and I want to say the final prayers before I die." So he comes down to there. And he comes into the room, and she's holding a crucifix. And he says to her, "What are you? You're a nice, Jewish woman your whole life. I should come down and say Shema with you. You're about to die." She says, "Well, you know what? I don't want to take no chances." And she's about to die. She don't take no chances. So that was Haran. Haran wasn't so sure. He believed in Abraham, but maybe Abraham was wrong. He wasn't so sure. So when Nimrod said to Abraham, "Either you bend down to idols, or I'm throwing you in the fire," and he got thrown in the fire, and God saved him, and he came out. So Haran said, "Okay, I'm going to do the same thing." And he said, "Okay, bow down, or I'm throwing you in the fire." He said, "Throw me in the fire." He threw him in the fire, and he died. Because he wasn't on the same level as Abraham. He didn't really believe. He only believed because he saw it happen to Abraham. So he expected it would happen to him, and it didn't. So he died, and he left behind a son. His son was Lot. Lot, it says, looked a lot like Abraham, and was Abraham's closest student. He followed everything Abraham did. So when Abraham left town, Lot went with him. But then here it tells you something, gets a little bit more revealing. So it says, "Vayikach Avram b'Sarai ishto." Abraham took his wife Sarah. Right, her name was Sarai at that point. V'es Lot ben Achiv, and Lot his nephew. V'es kol ruchusham, and all of his belongings, asher rakshu es nefesh asher asu b'charon, that he inherited all of the souls that he took in Charon. V'tzeisu lelechas artza Canaan, and they went towards the land of Canaan. So here you see that Abraham takes Sarah and Lot and all of the things that he had, like all of his belongings, and then it says a nefesh asher asu b'charon, the soul that he made in Haran. Here it's talking about the people that he reached out to, who he converted to monotheism. They went with him. They left where they were, and they went with him because they were followers of his. So they went with him. And it says, they went to the land of Canaan, and they got there. So what happens as soon as they get there? It says there was a famine. There's a famine in the land. Right? Like, what's going on here? In verse 10, God tells them, leave behind all of your things. Leave behind your father's house. Leave behind your land, everything. I will bless you. I will make you rich. I will make you famous. Just go where I tell you to go. I'm telling you, where they tell him, go to the land of Canaan. So what does he do? He walks to Canaan. You know, he was in what was called the Mesopotamian Triangle, Iran, Iraq area, and he walks to Israel, right? So when he walks to Israel and he gets there, there's a famine. God didn't promise him a famine. God promised him all the good things, and he has a famine. Like, what's he saying, right? So the idea is that Abraham had another test. Right? When God tells him this was going to happen, but he didn't say it was going to happen immediately. And he wanted to see to Abraham, okay, you gave up everything. You did what I told you to do. You took this long walk, and you came all the way to Israel, and now you're waiting for your reward? Not so fast. Right? First you have this, and so they find a famine. There's no food. So now they have to leave Israel, and they have to go to Egypt. And that's what happens next. And if you're at the bottom of this page, it occurred with Abraham's coming to Egypt. The Egyptians saw Sarah, his wife, that she was very beautiful. And the officials of Pharaoh saw her, and they lauded her for Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. So this is where you have the story, which I skipped over, where Abraham tells his wife, look, we're going down to Egypt. These Egyptians are very corrupt people. They have some rules, but in general, they're very corrupt. They even corrupt their own rules. Then and one of the rules is that if Pharaoh wants a woman, he gets the woman, unless she's married. If the woman's married, he can't take her because she's married. You can't take someone else's wife. That was a rule, even by the Egyptians. However, they corrupted the rule. So what they said is, it's true, we can't take their wife, but we can kill him. Then she doesn't have a husband, and now we can take her. So that Abraham says, this is what's going to happen. We go down there, they're going to see you. They're going to say, I'm your husband. They're going to kill me and take you. The alternative is that we say, you're not my wife. They'll let me live and they'll take you. Either way, they're taking you. So he says, tell them that you're my sister. And he goes down and they say it's a sister and they take her. Now, God makes it that nothing happens to her because he makes a miracle, right? That's what it says of what happens is that Pharaoh has an illness, right, because of Sarah, and he's not able to even touch her. So now Abraham, Pharaoh sends away Abraham's wife, Sarah, and he goes to complain to Abraham. And this is one of the first incidents that we start to understand a little bit of what anti-Semitism is. Here, what happens is Pharaoh comes, and he takes her against her will. He kidnaps her from Abraham, who's taking care of her. Either he's her husband or he's her brother, right? Either way, Pharaoh kidnaps her. When God curses him so that he's unable to touch her that night in his room, he goes to Abraham the next day, and he complains to Abraham that it's his fault. It says, Pharaoh summons Abraham, and he says, what is this you've done to me? Why did you not tell me that she's your wife? Why did you say she's my sister, that I would take her as my wife? Now here's your wife, take her and go. In other words, if he had said it was his wife, he would have killed him and then taken her. So instead, he said it was my sister. He takes him. God curses him. Either way, God's going to curse him. Curses him. He gets sick, and he goes back to Abraham and says, it's your fault. It's like if I go to your house, right, and I steal a pack of cigarettes from you, and then Mr. X steals it, and then he steals your cigarettes, and then he gets cancer. So he goes back to you and he says, it's your fault, I got cancer. Because I stole your cigarettes, and your cigarettes gave me cancer. Well, who told you to steal my cigarettes? They're my cigarettes. You stole them, right? Doesn't matter, right? It's your fault. And that's what Pharaoh goes to Abraham, it's your fault. And what do you do to the Jew? You make him leave. We don't want no Jews here. That's what's going to happen. So he does. They escorted them out. So it says, Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that was his. And here's where you have a very interesting statement. It's number one in this next one. It says, V'yal Avram Mitzrayim, and Abraham went up from Egypt, hu v'ishto, him and his wife, v'chol asher lo, and everything he owned, v'lot imo, and Lot was with him, hanegba, and they went together. So let's think about this. This doesn't sound like a very good statement, even in English. Abraham went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that was his, and Lot with him to the south. So that's not how you say a sentence. It would be, Abraham went up from Egypt, he with his wife, and Lot, and everything that was theirs. Instead it says, he, his wife, everything that was theirs, and Lot. Why is Lot after the belongings? Right? You should put Lot before the belongings. Right? In a matter of importance, you can understand it was Abraham. The whole story is about him. He has a wife, so of course she's important to him. So she's next. Then Lot is the next person. It's his nephew. He's taking care of him. He should be next. And then his belongings. Abraham's a righteous guy. He knows his belongings are important, but not more important than Lot. More important than a person. So the Torah is telling us something very interesting here. We're about to see a problem between Lot and Abraham. They were up until this point, Lot and Abraham were like father and son, like two brothers. They looked alike, they acted alike. Lot did everything Abraham did. Suddenly now there's going to be a fight between Lot and Abraham. And the Torah just told you why. And why? Because of money. It says Abraham took Sarah and all his belongings and Lot. Lot put his belongings before himself. His belongings were so important to him, money was so important to him, that he separated himself from Abraham by his belongings. Abraham understood that belongings, objects, money are important, but they're not the purpose of life. They're a means to life. And Lot was confused. Right? So therefore it says that Lot put his belongings between him and Abraham, right? Metaphorically. to show that his belongings were so important to him. And now you're going to see it. It says, Abraham was laden with livestock, silver and gold. He proceeded on his journey, right, on and on and on. Then the next paragraph, and Lot, who went with Abraham, had flocks, cattle, and tents. And the land could not support them dwelling together, for their possessions were abundant, and they were unable to dwell together. And there was quarreling between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And the Canaanite and the Perizzite were then dwelling in the land. So then Abram says to Lot, there should be no more fighting between me and you, right, and from our herdsmen, because we are relatives. Is not all the land before you? You go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. Let's just split up, right? We can't be together anymore. So this is very deep and hints to some very important things here. First thing, it tells you Abraham became rich and Lot became rich, right? Both of them. And it says, but then if you look at the sentence 6, in the Hebrew it's much more evident, but I'll read it in Hebrew but translate it. It says, the land was not big enough for them to live together. Because they had a lot of property, a lot of belongings. And they couldn't live together. Now, didn't we just say that? They couldn't live together because they had a lot of belongings, so they couldn't live together? Isn't that sort of superfluous? Just say, they had a lot of belongings, they couldn't live together. Or they couldn't live together because they had a lot of belongings. But they say, they couldn't live together because they had a lot of belongings, therefore they couldn't live together. Why is the Torah telling us that twice in one sentence? The Torah has no extra words. So why would the Torah put in that whole extra sentence? So it's telling you something. It says, first it says that they couldn't live together because they had so many belongings. Okay, both things happen. Sometimes people disagree, right? But then it gets to a point where anything that you do makes it we can't live together. In other words, they always say that if you love someone, you'll overlook anything they do wrong. But as soon as you don't, anything they do is bad. Right? So you can see it even without love. If you care for somebody and they're doing nice, they act nicely to you, whatever they do that's not 100%, you say, yeah, they're good people, they're okay. But as soon as they do something different, right, then everything they do is bad. I see it with divorces all the time. When people going through divorces, when I'm counseling, right, they can come in and forgive each other, all kinds of stuff when they're married. But as soon as they decide they're getting divorced, any little thing, they're always looking at the worst, right? And that's what's happening here, right? They were getting along just fine. Then they became rich, and Lot treated his money as being very, very important, and had very little consideration for others, and therefore they couldn't live together at all, at all, right? So Abraham says, okay, you pick. You go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. But we can't be together anymore. That's it. So the one person who was his closest student, who was his relative, who looked like him, who followed him from their home, has been corrupted by money. This is the first real example you see of someone really corrupted by money. Right? And the end result is he ends up moving to Sodom. Right? The one place where you would not expect a spiritual person to go. It's like, you can imagine a guy, I remember this when I was teaching in the yeshiva, when I was one of my first jobs, and everybody who worked there had to take a couple of cities to raise money. So I had to take like some cities in Arizona, like one trip to Arizona and Nevada. So they told me, if you go to this town outside of Las Vegas, there's a guy there who'll give you a donation. So I was already seeing people in this one area, so I said, okay. So I drove to that town, it's actually 25 minutes away, and I get there, and there's a guy there who looks like he's right out of Williamsburg. Like he's, like a real Hasidic, like guy, talks with Yiddish and English, and he's like really learned, and thinking, what's this guy doing in the middle of nowhere? He's all by himself. There's nobody here. And he was in the witness protection. He had been gotten in trouble, right, with the mafia, and the government put him in witness protection. They sent him out there. But he sort of stood out, right? He sort of stood out. But the point is that it was incongruous for him to be there. It was just so weird that he would be in such a place like that, right? That's right. So that's Lot going to Sodom. It's like Lot deciding, I'm going to live in Bnei Brak. because it's a holy city and there's no bad things to see, and there's no pornography, and there's no this, there's no that. I'm going to live there. And then he suddenly wakes up today and says, I'm moving to Las Vegas. Well, Las Vegas from Bnei Brak? That makes no sense. Right? Las Vegas is not a terrible place to live, but if you purposely live in Bnei Brak because you want to have a sheltered life, you don't move to Las Vegas because you're not going to get a sheltered life there. So right? That's what he did. Right? So you see, Lot was corrupted by money. And he went to the one place where they had all these crazy rules about money. You could only move to Sodom if you came in with a lot of money, because they wouldn't let just anybody come in. You had to buy your way in. That's what we see here. All right, the next thing we have, beginning on 61, is the fight, the war. The First World War. Right? I asked people, when was the First World War? Right? This is the First World War, beginning on page 61, chapter 14. And it happened in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Atrio, king of Eleazar, Shalender, king of Elam, Tidal, king of Golim, and they made war. You have the 4 kings going to war against the 5 kings. And it says that they kidnapped, one of them kidnapped Lot. The 5 kings kidnapped, and they captured Lot and his possessions. Right, Abraham's nephew, and they left, for he was residing in Sodom. Right, so here the 4 kings kidnapped the Lot, and now there's a world war. And it says then, if you look in the bottom of page 63, verse 13, then there came the fugitive, and told Abraham, the Ivri, who dwelt in the plains of Mamre, the Amorite, the brother of Eshcol and the brother of Aner, and he told him that his kinsman, Lot, was taken captive. So here's what happened. First thing is, who is this fugitive? The fugitive was Og. You might have heard of Og. Og was a person who was a giant. They say he was from before the flood. He was born before the flood. He was a superhuman who was able to survive the flood. And he lived all the way, you'll see him actually referenced, all the way till the time of Moshe. You'll see his name. That he lived all the way till Moshe. Right? If it's literally the same person or not, but the Torah seems to have his name in there. And here he comes, it says he does a good deed. He comes to Abraham. He says, Abraham, those kings, they kidnapped your nephew. You better go get him. They're going to kill him. Right? A good deed. Right? So it says here, it wasn't a good deed. Right? He was superhuman. He lived through the flood. He was a giant, they say. He was strong. He had every physical attribute he was perfect with. Right? So he was a king of the physical world. Abraham was the king of the spiritual world. And they had and Abraham had something that Og wanted, his wife. Sarah was the princess. Right? Whoever was with her, they had a future. She was a very powerful person. She was the force behind Abraham. And Og wanted her. So Og didn't go to Abraham and say, "Go, I'm coming to tell you a good deed. Your nephew's been kidnapped." He wants Abraham to go and get killed. Send him to war. Go fight. You one guy, you're going to go to war against the 5 kings? The 5 countries, right? One guy against 5 countries. Well, forget it. He ain't going to do it. It's not going to work. You're going to get killed. So Og wanted to kill him. That's why he went. It says he went. And Abraham goes, and what does he do? He wins. He goes to war and he wins. And it tells us on page 65 that the king of Sodom went out to meet him after the war, right? And he says that he wants to give Abraham, all these things. In verse 21, give me the people and take possessions for yourself. He tells Abraham, take the booty from the war. Take whatever you want. Abraham says, I lift up my hand to Hashem, God the Most High, maker of heaven and earth. It is so much as a thread to a shoe strap, or if I shall take from anything of yours, so you shall not say, it is I who made Abraham rich. In other words, the king of Sodom comes to Abraham and says, look, we won the war. You get Lot back. You captured all these people. Right? You have no need for people. Give me back the people. They're my people. Right? Give me the people, and you can have all the money, everything that was conquered. You conquer a country. You take their treasury. Take it. You can take it all. Abraham picks up his hand and says, I swear to God, I will not even take a shoestring, right, or a piece of leather from you. Nothing. Because you go around telling people you made Abraham rich. right? And I don't want the world to think that the king of Sodom made me rich, right? So the commentary says, why not? What's the big deal, right? So first thing it tells us that we have to understand it, what was really going on. Certainly, Abraham was rich beforehand. We said that already. He already was rich. So now he's going to get all of this. He didn't want, on a simple level, that the king of Sodom, who was an evil person, should go and say that I made Abraham rich. Abraham owes me. That's one. But another thing is that Abraham understood when you go to war, right, you can't say in the end, no matter how amazing that what you did in that war, that it was you who did it. It's God who's behind us that does it, right? This is what happened in Israel. You had the 6-day war. Anybody, I was too young to be there, but if you were in Israel after the 6-day war, I'm told that people who weren't even religious were talking about miracles. You wouldn't believe the miracle that happened here, and the miracle that happened here, and the miracle that happened. All these crazy stories, like one tank, right? You got the entire Egyptian army to run away, right? And these are documented stories, right? Amazing miracles, right? Everybody knew it. But what happened very quickly? They said, it wasn't a miracle, it was us. We're strong. We're not the ghetto Jews. We're the strong Israeli Jews. And we can fight for ourselves. And then what happens? The Yom Kippur War. They almost lost the whole country because they were so sure it was them. That's called Kochi v'otzem yadi. I won this by my strength and my power. Right? And God says that never happens. You got to remember, you're Jews. You win because you're Jewish. That's why you won. Because I was with you. The Torah says it, and I was with you. That's why you won. So Abraham is saying here, God made me rich. And I'm swearing all of this, puts his hand up to the God, I'm swearing all of this to God. God won the war, not me. So all of this is dedicated to God. I'm donating all of this to the temple, right, to Judaism. Another one was, it says he puts up his hand. That's what it says. He put up his hand in front of his face, and he said, I am all of this I am dedicating to God. Meaning, it's not my hand that won the war. He's talking to his hand. You didn't win the war. Right? It's not my power that won the war. It's God who did it. I'm dedicating all of this to that. I should never say that it was my hand that won the war. Right? Abraham understood the truth behind it. So that's why it says what it says here. Now, Abraham's starting to get old. And he says, you promised me that I would be a great nation. And you know who's going to inherit me? My slave, Eliezer, from Damascus. He's a Syrian. Right? What happened to this great talk? I'm going to make a great nation. Right? So Abraham says it. My Lord, what can you give me, seeing that I go childless, and the steward of my house is the Damascus Eliezer? And Abraham says, see to me, you have given no offspring, and see, my steward, my assistant, he inherits me. Suddenly the word of God came to him, says, this one will not inherit you. Only him that comes forth from you shall inherit you, by your own child. And he took him outside, and he said, gaze now towards the heavens, and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he turned in Hashem, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. So, what does that all mean? Right? He wants to, God, you promised me that I'd be a great nation. Well, I don't have any children. I'm going to lose everything. I'm old. I'm going to die, and all of my stuff's going to get taken by this Syrian, who's a wonderful man, who takes care of me. But he's not my child. I'm finished. God says, don't worry. Go outside and count the stars. And your children will be as countless as the stars. So tell me, you can't count the stars. And not only that, there are not as many Jews as there are stars, right? So what is God saying? Go out there and count the stars, and your children, so too will be your children, right? Because we understand it to mean is that go out and count the stars, and your children will be as countless as the stars. But that's not what he says. He says, so too will be your children. So many commentaries, but one of them is worthy of saying, is that God says to Abraham, go out there and count the stars. And he starts doing it. Does Abraham know that you can't count stars? Of course he knows it. Anybody, we know it. You walk outside, try counting the stars. See if you can never do it. You can't do it. Besides the fact that you can hardly count even one area, there's so many stars, you can't count them all. You'd be there forever. And what God tells him, go count the stars, he goes to count the stars. he goes to do it. And God says to him, so too will be your children. Just like you will listen to me, even when you think it's crazy, it's not possible to count the stars, but if I tell you to do it, you're going to do it. Your children will be the same way. Your children will be just the same. Right? Just like, and another interpretation is that just God tells him to go count the stars, and he goes out there and he realizes you can't count these stars, right? They're miraculous. There's just so many of them. They're an amazing miracle. So too will be your children. They also will be a miracle. The fact that the Jewish people exist today in 2016, right now that we exist, is a miracle. If you look, God promised Abraham you would have your children will always exist, and they'll always be small number. We won't be big, right? Who would expect that? What civilization's been around as long as us? Maybe the Chinese. They're the largest in the world. There's billions of them. We're less than 1% of the world, but we've been around as long as them, right? So the fact that we're forever is still here. The fact that we're small is still true. Both of those things are true, just like God said they would be, right? And that's a miracle. It's a miracle. Like, have you ever read the story by Mark Twain? He wrote an essay about going to Israel, going to Palestine, it was called then, on a religious Christian group. And he talks about the amazing story of the Jews. Right? He has a whole long essay about how the Jews are they're a riddle. They can't understand them. How do they exist? They had the Romans and the Assyrians and the Persians and the Babylonians all tried to destroy them. All of these great nations rose up, made a lot of noise, changed the world, went to war with the Jews and lost. The next one comes, makes a lot of noise, changes the world, goes to war with the Jews and loses. And today, the Persians are gone, the Romans are gone, the Assyrians are gone, the Babylonians are gone. Who's here? The Jews. The Jews. It shows you there's got to be a God. That's what God was saying to Abraham. Your people will be like that. No one will be able to understand why you still exist. No one will understand it. Because for all rules of nature, you should not exist. Every nation of the world tried to destroy you. You think one of them might have been successful? But they won't. I'm promising you, Abraham, you will be the father of a great nation. And that's what he tells him by tells him to go outside. Then he says, I am Hashem who brought you out of Ur Kasdim. That's the hint to the fire that I told you about, to give you this land. And God says to him, whereby shall I know that I'm going to inherit? God says, how do I know you're telling me the truth? Right? How do I know it's going to happen? So they make a covenant. It's called the covenant of the meat, because they take sacrifices, and he makes a covenant with the sacrifices. And that's where God promises him that what's going to happen to the people. And here's we have the premonition of going down to Egypt and the slavery, and then the future, and that ends that part. We then continue on 71 here, where we now have Sarah is really the main protagonist in the story. Sarah, Abram's wife, right, who had no children, but she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar. And Sarah says to Abraham, look, God says you're going to have kids, so maybe it doesn't mean from me. Maybe it means from someone else. So take my maidservant. She'll have the child, because I can't have children. You have the child with her, and I'll raise the child. So the child you'll be the father, right? And we'll take care of the child. We'll raise the child to be a good person. So Sarah, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, her maidservant, after 10 years of Abraham's dwelling, and gave her to Abraham, her husband, as a wife. And it says he has relations with her, and she gets pregnant. Now, while she's pregnant, it says that she rebels against Sarah. I mean, you can imagine. She says, you're my boss. I'm your husband's wife, just like you. And not only that, I'm pregnant. You're not. So she's saying, I got to listen to you. Right? So Sarah goes and she says, we can't have this. And she sends her out. Right? An angel of Hashem found her by the spring of water in the desert. And there she is by the desert. She's running away. And the angel says, go back. Right? Go back to Sarah. And he says, I'll greatly increase your offspring, and they will not be counted for abundance. And an angel of Hashem said to her, behold, you will conceive and give birth to a son, and you shall name him Ishmael, for Hashem has heard your prayer. Yishmael means Shema, to hear. God heard. Right? and he shall be a wild ass of a man, his hand against everyone, everyone's hand against him. So what is that really saying? In Hebrew, it says, V'hu yeh para adam. Para is an animal, like a wild animal, and adam is a person. So he's like a wild person, half man, half animal. Except that's not really true, because when in Hebrew, the first word is the noun, and the second word is an adjective, so to speak. So the first word, here it's para. He's an animal, Adam, who acts like a man. So God is saying that this child of yours is going to be a wild. His name is Yishmael. What is he going to do? He's going to have his hand in everybody's pocket. And everybody's hand is going to be in his pocket. Right? They're going to steal from each other. Their whole life is going to be lies and stealing. That's Yishmael. Right? We know what became of Yishmael, right? His offspring. And it says, and she called the name of Hashem who spoke to her, you are the God of vision. For she said, can I even be here after having seen? Then the well was called the well. Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham called the name of his son that Hagar bore to him Yishmael. And Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore Yishmael to Abraham. Right? And then we have the whole story where Yishmael starts acting inappropriately, and he starts doing things to Yitzchak. Yitzchak's going to be born later, and he's acting wrong, and therefore they send him away. This is it's a very frightening story, because the Torah tells us the following: God comes to Abraham, tells him your wife's going to have a baby. His wife has a baby. They have to send, and the baby is Yitzchak. This comes up later, and then they say you have to send. Yishmael is basically torturing Yitzchak, either physically, emotionally. Somehow he's torturing him, and Sarah goes and says, "Listen, you have to get rid of this Hagar and the baby. They're going to kill Yitzchak." And Abraham doesn't want to do it because he's a nice person. He cares for people, and it's his own kid. And God says, "Listen, whatever your wife says, you have to listen to her. Whatever Sarah says, listen to her." That's explicit in the Torah. Whatever Sarah says, listen to her. So he sends her away. The Ramban is an amazing line here. The Ramban says that because of the sin of Sarah, by being so strict with Hagar and Yishmael, where they could die in the desert, till this day, the children of Hagar hate us. That's the Muslims. He says that in the 1100s, right? But it's still the case today that they hate us because our mother Sarah humiliated their mother Hagar, right? They don't even necessarily know why they hate us, but the Ramban said it there. And then today, when we look at it, we're trying to understand why is it that the Muslims hate the Jews so much? They're so much like us in their belief. They believe in monotheism. They believe in laws of how to eat. They believe in laws about interest. They believe in so much of what we believe in, right? They're so similar to us that way, and yet we're their number one enemy. They hate us. They want to kill us, right? Why? As the Ramban says, because of this. Because of how Sarah treated their mother. In other words, there was a certain amount of this pressure put on an underling. Now, I can't say that Sarah was wrong, who am I to say it, but the Ramban seems to think that was the case, and that's why he says that, and why they still hate us today, it says.
Rabbi, Yitzchak,
Yeah.
Obviously Avram, we know that Yitzchak had a Brit Milah, Avram did it on him. Is there anything to indicate, and I don't know it, that Yishmael also had a
It says it, he did.
Oh, it says
Yeah,
it.
but he was 13.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's why they have their...
So, if you look on 75, right, it talks about how every male should have a circumcision. This should be my covenant in your flesh. And God says to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, do not call her name Sarai, call her Sarah. And I'll bless her, and I will give you a son through her. And Abraham threw himself on his face, and he laughed. Shall a child be born to a 100-year-old man, and shall Sarah, a 90-year-old woman, give birth? And Abraham said to God, oh, that Yishmael might live before you. And God said, nevertheless, your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call his name Isaac, and I will fulfill his covenant with him. Abraham took his son Yishmael, and all the servants born in his household, and all that he had purchased for money, all the all the male members of Abram's household, and he circumcised the flesh of their superfluous on that very day, as God had spoken with them. So there says Ishmael was circumcised. And his son Ishmael was 13 years old when he was circumcised on the flesh of, all right, and on that very day when Abraham circumcised with Ishmael the son, and all the people of his household, born in his household, and purchased for money from a stranger, were circumcised with him. So that's where you find it, right? So this whole idea of circumcision, right, is commanded here. This is a physical sign upon our body to shows that we have a relationship with God. Now, later on, the Talmud has a story, talks about the Greek philosophers coming to talk to Rabbi Akiva, right? And they ask Rabbi Akiva a question. They say, what's greater, the acts of man or the acts of God? What's greater? So they expect, of course, Rabbi Akiva is a rabbi, he's going to say the act of God. So Rabbi Akiva says, as rabbis would, I'll come back later and I'll give you an answer. So they come back the next day and he's got a cake greater than the acts of God, because God made the wheat and man made the cake. So what is this story? Like Rabbi Akiva, cake, he wasn't a baker. What's the story in the Talmud for? Because that's not really what they asked. The Greeks asked Rabbi Akiva, what's greater, the acts of man or the acts of God? If it's the acts of man, if it's the acts of God, then why are you messing with the human body and circumcising him? God made the human being. He created human beings. He made them perfect. And the Greeks believed the human body was perfection. They're perfect. What are you cutting off a piece of the human being for? God made them perfect. You think you're better than God? What's greater, the acts of man or the acts of God? So Rabbi Akiva came back with the answer. God created man, right? No question, an act of perfection. But God wants us to finish the job. He wants us to go to the highest possible level. So circumcision is an act that we do, that God commanded us to do, to show that we have to perfect ourselves, to go to the next level, to be greater. That's what circumcision is. Circumcision is an act that we perform in order to show that as great as God made us, He gives us the potential to even be greater. And therefore we show it physically, but it's really it's a frame of mind. It's a way of looking at things. It's a spiritual thing. And that from that point on is the way Jews are supposed to be. We are supposed to be taking whatever God gave us and using it for better. That's why our whole concept of spirituality is based on our using the physical. Like, we don't think that you have to be poor to be a good person. You don't have to be single to be a good person. You could be married, you can do business, you can have a lot of wealth and be a good person. While most of the religions in the world say that money corrupts you, sex corrupts you, all of these things take you away. We say, no, they don't. You have to use them correctly. But if you use them correctly, then they're very spiritual things. And that comes from circumcision. That's what the idea is. All right, we better conclude with that.